Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you. My name is Jackie Guerrero. I am the director here at the Advancer Project of the Equity and Community Investments team. And we're very happy to have you because we are sharing the updated Justice Equity Need Index. Many of you may be somewhat familiar with what the Need Index is. But again, we're here to just share with you the update and also briefly walk you through the methodology and some findings. More importantly, how you can begin to use this for your own purposes and your own work. So if we can go to the next slide, please. If you haven't already, please be sure to drop in your name, organization, and the city and region where you work in, so that way we can see who's here and who's joining us from across the state. We also ask that if you have any questions, please use the chat function and make sure that your question is going to all panelists and attendees. You can also drop it into the question and answer, and we'll try to respond throughout the presentation. We all have also reserved some time at the end to be able to share or to answer any additional questions. And also, just as a reminder, we are recording this, we're recording the presentation. So you will be able to have a copy of the recording and a copy of the slide deck as well. And of course, the link, right? We have this information already on our website. So you can always go and access it to start your own investigation as well. Thank you so much. If we can go to the next slide. So I just want to present our slate of speakers this morning. Again, I'm Jackie Guerrero. I'm the director of the Equity and Community Investments team here at the Advancer Project California. I also have with me today my colleague Mayana Kalfani-King, who's a research and policy analyst here within the Advancer Project and within my team. And then also Maria Khan, who's a research and data analyst who spent a lot of time producing this information. So again, we're very excited to have you all here this morning with us. If we can go to the next slide. So what we're hoping to accomplish in this presentation this morning is to explain to you the updates that we've made to the Justice Equity Need Index. We know that maybe some folks are newer to it, so we will briefly recap what it is, but also just share with you the updates that we've added to it and the methods that we use to develop the tool. We will also walk you through how to use this tool in conjunction with the Justice Equity Service Index in your own examination of where need is and where the system of care is across LA County. And we'll share some key findings of the analysis, right, of what we've been able to see from the JESI 2022, which is this year's update versus last 3 years ago, the 2019 JESI. So hopefully you'll be able to walk away with some good tools, right, that you can start applying in your own work. If we can go to the next slide, please. So in the agenda, again, we're gonna talk to you about what justice equity means, why justice equity tools are really important in the work that we're all seeking to do in investing in the system of care. We're also going to give you a JENI overview and demonstration. This is where we'll walk you through how to use the tool and then how you can think about applying it. We'll share those findings that I mentioned, and then we'll wrap up with any additional questions. If we can go to the next slide. So for that, I will now pass it to my colleague, Mayana, who will walk us through what justice equity is and share a brief recap of what the tools that we've developed are. Thank you so much.
Welcome again for being here with us. So let's dive into how we got here. So justice equity tools, development and purpose. Next slide, please. So what is justice equity? We define justice equity as the fair sharing of resources and opportunity with those most impacted by the systemic injustice in our criminal justice system. In short, everyone having the tools and resources they need to live out their lives as they see fit. What can justice equity tools do? Reveal the deep, desperate impact the justice system has had on community, reimagine a just system built on community-driven prevention, healing, and health, and also reinvest public resources based on that vision. The tools that you're going to learn about today are the Justice Equity Needs Index, the JENI, and then also the Justice Equity Service Index, the JESI. Next slide, please. So our development and purpose. The JENI the Justice Equity Needs Index was originally created in 2019 with Community Coalition, LA Voice, and in partnership with LA Community Action Network, Homeboy Industries, Communities in Schools, and Californians for Safety and Justice. The JENI was created to be a data-driven, geographic, interactive map that identifies the areas within LA County with the greatest need of public investments to help reverse impacts of the criminal justice system. So why does this matter? Why is the JENI important? Without such a mapping, funding allocation disregards equity and continues to leave the most vulnerable populations out. A map that identifies high-need communities, aids advocacy strategies, and ensures resources and funding are targeted to those areas of need. So JENI's goal really is to fill a gap. It's an advocacy tool to inform budget allocation and programmatic strategies to build out equitable services across LA County. Next slide, please. So our Justice Equity Needs Index, it measures several indicators tend to be exact by zip code, resulting in a relative ranking of need. So the higher the ranking, the higher the need, but also the darker the color, the higher the need. And this is important because it gives decision makers a data-driven needs assessment that should be used to intentionally drive county investments. It helps guide county leaders to engage communities in heavily impacted areas to really understand needs and how they can best be addressed. But also our needs index, the JENI, should be coupled with our service index, the JESI, to assess needs and services available that help guide community engagement to funding allocations. Next slide, please. And now coming to our JESI, our Justice Equity Service Index. The JESI identifies LA County's justice-related community-based services and supports. It ranks zip codes from lowest to highest in relative service levels. We have several components that the JESI includes. We have health and wellness, we have housing and employment, prevention and intervention, and also community services and advocacy. And why is the JESI important? Prior to the service index, there were community partners that found no database that assessed the landscape for all the provider categories in a comprehensive location. So the JESI is the first step in building out a comprehensive community system of care. It can be used to aid policymakers and advocates to direct funding to where is most needed, but also inform where to shift investments and capacity building supports toward equity and justice. And with that, I can pass it to Maria for our next section.
All right, thank you so much, Mayana, for that great introduction of the tools, the JENI and JESI. So I'm gonna give us kind of an in-depth overview of the updated JENI. We're gonna be talking about the data that went into creating these tools, and I'll also walk us through how to use this spatial tool in your work for justice equity. So let's start with the components that make up the data that's going into the Justice Equity Need Index. So we have 3 different component categories that we have created with all of the different data indicators that we use to create the overall JENI scores, right? And so let's start with the first one, system involvement over here. And so system involvement, this is the component that's asking who is involved with the criminal justice system, right? And so we're looking at adult probation rates, we're looking at youth probation rate as well. And then the second component is inequity drivers. And so we're asking what is driving disparities that we see in the criminal justice system, right? And so with this, we're looking at a race composite score. This race composite score is just made up of basically communities that we know have more interaction and inequitable interaction with the criminal justice system. So we're looking at the Black, Latinx, NHPI, and AIAN community as well. And then we have an unemployment rate that we're looking at, adult population without a high school degree. We're also looking at a poverty rate. So we're specifically looking at persons living below 200% of the federal poverty level. And then we're also looking at the violent crime rate. And then lastly, our last component is criminalization risk. And so this component is asking, what are the factors that indicate a person is at risk of interaction or involvement in the system? And so with this, these are, again, analysis that is done to tell us that these indicators tell us when people have gone through this system, they're more likely to interact with the criminal justice system as well. So we're looking at the mental health hospitalizations, we're looking at alcohol and drug related hospitalizations, and then homelessness rate as well. And as far as the data sources go for all of these different data indicators that I just talked about, they all include a span of years to stabilize the data as much as we can. Most of the data is actually from 2019 and prior, because much of it just wasn't available for 2020 and beyond. We also were being careful because the 2020 American Community Survey data was also being questioned on its reliability due to the collection interruption that happened during the pandemic. For the other data sets that we do have that include 2020 data, like the crime rate, for example, that data is from its true universe, so from like the true population, it's not a sample. So it should be just as accurate as any other year. And you can find a full list of these sources on every single one of these indicators that I just talked about on our webpage if you're looking for a little bit more information on these. So now let's talk about, what's changed from JENI 2019 to now. What did we change in our methodology? Is there any new data that we use? And what does this mean, right? Did the change have any impact, essentially, right? So when we created the JESI in 2021, we learned a lot of lessons, and we wanted to apply those lessons to the JENI as well as give the JENI a facelift and a data update, with the years that had gone by. So one of the first things that I want to highlight as a change that happened is the race composite score that I just talked about as one of the indicators. So the race composite score uses census data to understand where groups who are more likely subjected to inequitable interactions with the criminal justice system live. So those groups, again, are Latinx, Black, NHPI, and AIAN. We know that there are definitely some groups within subcategories of the Asian community as well that can fall into this category. Unfortunately, with the census data that we had, we weren't able to disaggregate it that way. So that is one of the limitations. And so what we did do is we updated the methodology this year to uplift groups with smaller populations. So that's the AIN and NHPI community as examples, so that these groups are not overshadowed by some of these larger groups, right? Especially in our county. So we also excluded this year 2 or more races or other race, which we had prior. After we did some additional analysis, we found that areas with high percentages of these racial groups are often not aligned with areas historically impacted by the inequitable criminal justice system in the county, as what other groups were experiencing. And so that's the race composite score update. Then the second thing, bullet point that I want to talk about is new data. So we're really excited that this year we were able to get youth probation data that we did not have access to in 2019. So now we're able to see a more comprehensive understanding of system involvement. And then we also have a methodology update. So we did update the statistical methodology that we were using from 2019 to what we have now. And what we're using now is actually exactly what the JESI uses. So they match as far as the methodology goes. So the 2019 JENI, it measured the distance and direction of a zip code's value on an indicator or score on the index from the average, right? And so it's looking at those scores from the overall average. And unfortunately, the average can actually be skewed by very high or low values referred to as outliers. So what we did this year is to better understand how each zip code compares to one another. We used a percentile/ranking kind of methodology. And what this does is it ranks the zip codes in relation to one another, rather than to the average score. And so we believe that's gives us scores that are easier to kind of interpret and also see within a ranking kind of order. And then lastly, we have increasing user friendliness, right? So you can see this very clearly in kind of the visual that I have presented, right? So on the left side of the screen, you're looking at the JENI from 2019, which is a static map. And then on the right side of the screen, you're looking at the JENI from 2022, which is interactive, and we'll go much more into detail on, all of the different functions within this map, but it reflects a lot more of what the JESI actually looks like now. And yeah, we've been able to upgrade the map to make it a lot more user-friendly, hopefully, for you all to use. And so with all of these changes, what has that meant for the data, right? When we're looking at the JENI from 2019 to the JENI from 2022, what is the relationship between that, right? So running a correlation test, which is essentially is just looking at the relationship, between that 2019 and 2022 data, what we found is a really high correlation of 0.88. And what that means is that it indicates that the patterns of need haven't changed much between JENI 1 and 2, so between 2019 and 2022. This strong correlation and positive relationship also indicates that the methodological changes do not have an outsized impact on the JENI. Okay, so, okay. And so now I'm gonna, before I hop into the tool demonstration and start showing you how some of that works, we do want to propose some guidance on interpreting the data. So for decision making, especially policy decision making, it's really intended to use the JENI and JESI together. While the JENI is there to ask what are the needs of the population by zip code, the JESI is there to ask, well, what are the services available to populations by zip code, right? And together, we hope that you get some idea of where some of the most vulnerable kind of areas are, right? So we're really looking to look at JENI hotspots and JESI cold spot, right? Because the lower service areas are the areas where we want to say, okay, where do we not have justice equity services? And then for the JENI, right, we want to look at the hotspots. We want to look at the areas with highest high need. We want to say where are the areas that, according to this data and this index, are scoring to have a really high justice equity need, right? And putting those together. And most importantly, I really want to emphasize on this slide what's in the yellow kind of rectangle square here. Our tool is really not meant to eliminate community voices, but rather to enhance and complement them, right? It's really critical that to get the full picture, community insights are centered in the conversation, which is also why at the beginning of this presentation, right, we talk a little bit about the development of the index, and we worked alongside a lot of community partners to make sure that that was a part of our process in developing the tool as well. I want to emphasize that our indices, right, they provide analysis by zip code, but they're definitely not providing solutions by zip code, right? The data is giving you an analysis, but not necessarily the answer. And we can't set any hard and fast rules that the highest service areas don't need any support at all, or that only the highest need levels need support, right? And let me just talk a little bit about some examples of what I mean. So for example, you can have a zip code with a really high need on JENI, right? And this same zip code can have a really high service level as well. But this area in the zip code, they could still be struggling to meet an even greater need, right? And one thing important to mention about the JESI is that one of the limitations of the JESI is that the services are mapped by headquarters. So not all service provision locations are actually included in the JESI, right? So again, high service levels do not always translate to no need for greater capacity. And then on the flip side, another example is when you have low service levels, they're not always going to translate to a need for greater capacity as well, right? So you could have a zip code that has a low service level, and it may look like it needs additional services, but what if that zip code is also a low justice equity need zip code, right? So perhaps that service level is actually the right size for that level of justice equity need in that area. So we want to keep all of that in mind as we look at the JENI today. And yeah, now let's go ahead and start hopping into actually looking into the tool, how it gets used, and the applications of it. Great. So how to use the JENI. In developing the Justice Equity Need Index, we discussed, who are our target users? what questions they may have, and how can the JENI as a tool specifically answer some of those questions. So I'm going to use this chart that we have here to walk us through some of these use case scenarios and do a live demonstration of these applications that I have listed. So give me a second, I'm just gonna switch my screen. Oops, okay, and pull up the JENI. Okay, so here we have the JENI webpage on the APCA website. And on this webpage, starting out, you see a lot of information about the JENI, a lot of which, we have covered in this presentation, talking about what the JENI entails, what justice equity entails, the methodology, and a lot of specifics as well on this page. And then once you get down here, you see the main JENI map. So before we hop into that, let's go back to our chart really quick, right? So when we thought about users, one of the first users that we thought about were advocates, right? And advocates, we thought about, these are individuals who are potentially going to be using the JENI to, be advocating to policymakers, to decision makers, to perhaps like foundations and funders for justice equity services or programming, right? So what kind of questions could advocates have? One of the questions that we highlighted is, what are the hotspots in LA County with the highest/high need, right? So perhaps these advocates are in a place where they want to go and talk to communities that have highest/high need. And so how can they find out where those communities are, right? And so the JENI is a tool that could help do that. So when we're looking at the JENI, here is the main JENI map. As you can see, it's interactive, but I want to point out a couple of things on this map. So the first thing is taking a look over here on the bottom left corner. What you're seeing is the color spectrum that shows the range from lowest to highest need. So the lowest is going to be that yellow kind of shade, and the darker shades of red is indicating a higher need on the percentile score for the JENI, right? And so already, just by understanding this color spectrum, I can take a look at this map, and I can start seeing where some of these darker red and dark orange areas are, and start identifying where some of these hotspots are, right? So I'm seeing a lot of the dark red areas here in South LA. I'm seeing some over here in kind of like Upper East Mid San Fernando Valley, and I'm also seeing some here in the Antelope Valley, right, etc. And so I'm already starting to see some of these hotspots. Now with the JENI, I can also zoom in if I want to see a particular area. So let's say I wanted to take a look at Inglewood. So I can go ahead and click this. Once I click one of these zip codes, over here on this side panel, I am brought up to where it gives me the zip code that I'm looking at. It also will tell me the percentile score, as well as the scores for each of those three components that we discussed: system involvement, inequity drivers, and criminalization risk, right? And then it's telling me how it ranks on each one of those components as well. And then a couple of more information over here as well about that zip code, right? But what I think is, this is helpful, but what I think is really helpful, especially for doing a hotspot analysis, as perhaps an advocate would be doing, is that we have this function over here. Let me just zoom out. I think it's going to be better to see. If you click this little icon over here on the top right corner, it's going to bring up a couple of layer options, right? So firstly, you have the JENI 2019. So you can go ahead and look at where were the high/highest need zip codes in the JENI for 2019, and you'll see they're pretty similar to what we're seeing in 2022, right? And so this proves that correlation test that we were looking at, where there was a really high positive relationship between JENI 2019 and JENI 2022, right? The other thing that you can look at is, okay, where on the JESI, where are the low/lowest service zip codes, right? And when you click it, you can start seeing with this black outline where those low/lowest service level zip codes are. And you can start matching that up to the high/highest JENI need zip codes, right? So I think what's interesting is like, right, you want to start looking at areas like over here in the Antelope Valley, and you're seeing that all of these highest zip codes on need are also lowest/low JESI zip codes, right? And so this gives you that moment to say, okay, what's going on over here, right? I'm seeing really high need, and I'm seeing really low service level, right? And so this is potentially an avenue for, you know, an advocate community to say, okay, what kind of advocacy is being done in this area? Do I need to go and talk to communities here and find out more about justice equity specifically in this region? And you can, you know, click and get the exact zip codes of these regions as well if you would like. So that's that question. So let's go ahead and move into a different use case scenario. So the second one that we wanted to highlight is service providers. So as a service provider, right, you could be asking questions of, you know, what areas are in higher need of our services for perhaps rehabilitation or prevention, right? Like, I want to provide these services or these programming, where potentially should I be looking at to do that, right? And so the JENI can actually be a tool for that. If we scroll down to the web page, we come to the second map that we have on the JENI, which is actually a component map. So it looks at the same information, but we're looking at it from the perspective of one of the components that makes up the JENI, right? And so this is for the inequity driver.
Jackie,
Yeah.
do you mind zooming in a little bit more on the map?
Sure. I can do that.
That might be easier, I think, for some folks to see.
Yeah, give me a second.
Mhm.
Does that help? I think it's zoomed in a little bit.
Yeah.
I can do it again. It's gonna cut off a little, but we'll work with it.
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so yeah, looking here at the top, right, we have the inequity drivers tab, and so this is showing you the inequity drivers percentile and the level as a range, right? Here's the color spectrum for that one to understand kind of where the darker shades again are going to be the higher inequity driver need, and the lower shades will be the lower. And then if you click on the second tab, you'll see that same concept for criminalization risk, right? And if you recall, we do have 3 components. So the component that's missing from here is system involvement, and that's on purpose. System involvement is largely probation data, as we talked about, and that being some sensitive information, we didn't want to include that to be publicly available, but it is available upon request if needed. So yeah, so let's take a look at inequity drivers per se, right? And so going back to our use case scenario, right? Let's say I'm a service provider, and let's say I want to know what are the higher need of our services for, let's say, prevention, right? So to do some prevention programming. So perhaps I want to look at inequity drivers, right? Because these are areas that I know are being driven by inequity, right? And so potentially this is where I want to do some prevention work. And so what I can do is, similarly to the last one, start identifying some of the hotspots here. I also have some of those same layering kind of options, and the ones that I didn't show previously, we also have options to look at the supervisorial districts as well and layer that over this tool. And so you can take a look at, you know, if you're thinking about working, or let's say you work for a, you know, a specific district, or you have a project for a specific district, you can start looking at what exactly that looks like for that region, right? And the same thing for the service planning areas as well. You can see where some of those overlays are. And then if I click on one of the zip codes, so let's just zoom in here. Let's say I click in over here on this zip code. And so this is zip code 93550, right? And so I'm able to get on the side panel what the inequity drivers percentile is. That's going to be the score and the level at the top. And then it's going to show me what it looks like for JENI overall and the other component percentiles over here. And it's also going to tell me how it ranks on the scales compared to the other zip codes, right? And then the great thing is actually in this component map, you also get the raw data for each one of the indicators that make up this component, right? So I can see in this exact zip code 93550, what is the percentage of Black population in this area, right? What is the percentage of population without a high school diploma? And so I can see a little bit more of that data on the inside that creates this map. So that makes up that second map. And I just want to quickly mention for some of y'all that might work a little bit in like web development, might have a little bit more tech savvy skills. We do have a embed as well. So we have this iframe, so you can go ahead and just easily embed that onto your own website if you wanted to use this map and put it up on your own site and use it for further analysis. And speaking of kind of further analysis, the next thing that I'm going to talk about also allows you to do that. So the last use case scenario we have is as a fund distributor, right? So this could be a government institution, a foundation, right? And so one of the questions that you may be asking is, okay, what are the zip codes with the highest need levels in LA County, right? So I want to know exactly what those zip codes are, right? And so we have a data table, if you keep scrolling, and in this data table, you can get exactly what those kind of, that exact kind of data, right? So it's gonna have much of that same like percentile scores that we have for the components for the overall JENI, as well as these indicators as well that we've talked about, right? So, and you're able to download this as both a CSV or Excel as well. So you have all of this information available to you. Again, the system and involvement indicator, so the probation data is not included in this data table for sensitivity, but it is available upon request as well. And the other thing you can do is we have a filtration system, right? So you can start by just kind of organizing. Let's say I wanted to see by like, I don't know, highest population. So I can start organizing this, to see it by where some of the highest population zip codes are and how they're ranking, all right? But I can also filter by coming in here and typing in, right? So let's say I wanted to look at highest, on keyboard. Right, so now that's filtered down to just the highest scores, right? And then let's say I want to look at this for, let's say District 4, right? And so I pull that down for District 4. I can download this as an Excel. Let me pull it up so y'all can see just a little bit of what that looks like once you get it downloaded. Cool. So here you have all of the highest zip codes in supervisorial District 4, right? And I can see for these zip codes, the neighborhood, I can see the different percentile scores that we have, as well as all those indicators that we talked about, right? And then with this Excel sheet, right, there's a couple of different things that we can do with it, right? So I'm not gonna give like a whole kind of demonstration here, but like just something small, right? Like let's say we wanted to see how much of that the population does that mean, right? So we know after doing a quick sum that there's 434,156 individuals living in a highest category level zip code in District 4, right, on the JENI. So things like that we can do. We can also do averages of these different kind of indicators, et cetera, et cetera. And so this really gives you that raw data to take, the JENI and do more with it, right? And to use the application of it beyond. Cool. Do we have a question, Jackie? I see you on video.
No question. No.
Okay. Cool. Okay, great. So yeah, that wraps up the JENI kind of demonstration. And I'll pass it over to Jackie for us to take a quick pause before we dive into some of the findings.
Thank you, Maria. If you don't mind keeping your share screen, Maria, for a second, that would be great. So while Maria pulls up the presentation, I just wanted us to take a moment to take a breath, because that while we are looking at a data tool, these are really snapshots of view of people's lives. individuals, community members, Black and brown communities have been historically impacted by the criminal justice system, right? And so while it is helpful to have these tools, we also know that, again, these points on a map are lives, right? Our communities. So we want to take a moment of breath just to sit with that for a second, and also give ourselves some space as we now transition to some of the higher level findings. Because again, the demonstration was very helpful to see it at a very zip code level snapshot and hotspots. But now we're going to talk about at least some trends of what we're seeing. And again, this is an initial analysis. As you start to use this in your own work, you can always contact us as well if you need additional supports to walk you through some of the data or if there's some more specific questions. So now I'll pass it back to Maria, who can now share some of the high-level findings. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that quiet moment. And let's go ahead and discuss some of the key takeaways from the updated JENI now. So we're going to talk about some of the key findings. So hotspots, right? We've been talking a lot about that. So one of the hotspots that stood out doing the JENI on the map is South LA, right? So this region, and you all may have been already picking up on this already as I was doing some of the demonstration, right, has a really high concentration of zip codes that rank highest/high need on the JENI. And we'll actually go into a little bit more detail as well of what some of the percentages actually look like as well in this region, ranking some of the highest/high zip codes, right? And then other areas that also have hotspot, we talked a little bit about the Antelope Valley. That area is also a hotspot with a high concentration of zip codes with the highest/high JENI need. And then we also see the same thing reflected in downtown, in the east side of Los Angeles, as well as this San Fernando Valley area as well. And I want to emphasize, some of these areas, it tends to be that it's more of the urban centers where you see some of these hotspots, as you might already be picking up on as well just by seeing some of these regions. So those are some of the hotspots identified. And then overall, right, so overall as a county, kind of how are we doing? Almost half of LA County residents live in a zip code with highest/high JENI need level. So that's 48.7%. So how I'm getting that 48.7% number, if you look over here on this little table, you see 24 and 24.7. So I just added those two numbers up, right? And I think that number alone is really astounding and important to remember, because it just shows that we have a long way to go as far as justice equity goes, and there's a lot of population within LA County that is living in an area that could potentially use a little bit more services for justice equity, right? And then on the flip side, we want to take a look over here on the lowest score, and we see that only 13.7% of the population is living in a zip code with the lowest justice equity need levels, right? Unfortunately. And then on the JESI, in the same respect, we unfortunately see the same pattern where we would hope to see that, we'll see high service levels of justice equity more common. We see the opposite, right? We see that 46.7% of the county residents live in a zip code experiencing the low or lowest justice equity service levels. And so now let's take a look at that exact concept, right? Matching service levels to need levels, right? And we talked a little bit about this earlier on in the presentation as well. And with the JENI analysis, what we found is that the communities with the higher justice equity need, they don't have higher levels of service, right? So our data is not showing any sort of strong negative or positive relationship between the JENI and JESI scores. And so what this means is that, when you have a higher need zip code, it's just as likely to have a higher service level as it is to have a lower service level, right? And so if you're looking at this visual that I have here of the JENI map, and I've selected the layer for the low/lowest service zip codes, you can see that while some of the darker red areas indicate that they have low services, you can also see that, it really ranges, right? I'm also seeing that I'm not seeing some areas here that are dark red to have low service levels, right? So there isn't necessarily a need to service match that we're looking at here, right? So unfortunately, as you can see, there are many high zips in red and dark oranges with these thick black outlines as well. And this is indicating potentially a mismatch with low service levels. So now let's zoom in and do a little bit of geographic centering and do a little bit of a regional analysis. So the first thing is that I want to point out for both districts 1 and 2, so right over here for supervisorial districts 1 and 2 here, the majority of their population, so more than 50%, are living in a zip code with the highest/high JENI need, right? And for particularly District 2, it's not just highest/high, but 51% of the population is living in a highest justice equity need level zip code, right? And much of that is actually this region that we talked about, South LA, right? So you're looking at the South region over here in the county, and you're seeing a lot of highest need zip codes in this area. And then the other thing to point out actually for this area as well is we take a look at the lowest scores. It's great to kind of see just the spectrum as well, because looking at the lowest, you also see that not only do they have the highest, there's also the lowest percentage of zip codes and population living in a zip code with the lowest JENI need level in this district, right? And it's much lower than any of the other scores that we're looking at. And then let's look at District 3. District 3, I think, is a really good example of a district to look at, because at a glance, you can take a look at it visually and you can say, oh, I see a lot of lowest, yellow over here on the coastal kind of side and like surrounding over here. So I'm thinking maybe the JENI need levels are not that high in this district, right? But if you took a look at the high score for District 3, you'll see that 30.4%, which is one of the higher percentages compared to all of the districts, largely in this San Fernando Valley kind of area, are experiencing a high need level, right, on the JENI scale. And then when we look at District 4, you'll see that just below kind of half, so about 41.5% of their highest of their residents are living in a highest/high need area. And so that's District 4, right over there. And then District 5. District 5 is another good district to look at because you see such a range, right? So you see the District 5 population is more kind of evenly distributed from highest to lowest levels, right? So at a glance, you could take a look at this and maybe say, oh, it has a lot of, highest levels, right? But when you actually get looking a little bit more deeper, you see that it really can range in this district. Depending on where you are in the district, you can be experiencing a really different need level for justice equity. Now let's take a look from a different geographical centering and a different kind of perspective as far as geographies go. And so we now want to ask, how many people live in the highest/high JENI need level by the service planning area level, but also by component as well. So over here, we're looking at criminalization risk, inequity drivers, and system involvement, right? So these are the 3 components that we had talked about earlier and have been talking about. I want to actually start with SPA level 6 over here, the South, right? And you can see now even greater that exact point that we made earlier on in our key findings, how the need levels are being impacted over here in justice equity in the South, right, in region 6, SPA 6, right? So we see that SPA 6 has some of the highest scores compared to the other SPAs in every single component, right? So in every single component, they have some of the highest scores, except for maybe, I think, system involvement, right? And then, of course, in inequity drivers, this is an alarming number to see, is that 100% of the population is living in a zip code with the highest/high need levels in the inequity drivers component for SPA 6, right? And then for SPA 4, the residents here in this region right over here are experiencing the second highest percentage in this component for inequity drivers, right? So this is the highest and this is the second highest. You can see that there's like a difference between them, but 76.6% is still a very, very high number. And in every component almost, right, if you were just to round up the system involvement number, about half or more of the residents are living in a high/high JENI need level by these different components, right, that we're looking at. And then finally, I'm just going to highlight SPA level 1, looking at the Antelope Valley region once again. We see that, you know, mentioned this a little bit earlier, but 98% of that population is living in a zip code with high system involvement. And on the other end, we see that while this is still, you know, like it's 37.4%, like that's still a lot of people, but it's much less than what we see in system involvement, right? So we're seeing that the criminalization risk tends to be on a lower kind of in terms of how many people that are living in a zip code that have that kind of percentage of high need versus system involvement, right? And so this kind of gives us an opportunity to pause and say, okay, you know, what's kind of going on over here where we see a really high system involvement percentage and a little bit of a lower criminalization risk percentage, right? And so, yeah, so that wraps up the findings section. Just wanted to give you all a little bit of a quick kind of analysis on the different findings that we found looking into JENI 2022 and what we saw analyzing some of the hotspot areas and analyzing the different regions that we have throughout LA County.
Maria, for that. So to round us out, before we open it up for questions, we really just wanted to conclude some things. So the justice tools provide us with a roadmap to where resources and coordination are needed. But we also really want to emphasize that data tools should not substitute community engagement. Engaging with community-based organizations and system-impacted residents is really critical to really ensure that resources and supports meet the need for justice equity. Thank you all for being here. I'm now going to pass it to Jackie, and we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Mai and Maria, for walking us through the applications of the tool and the findings. So we want to just take the last few minutes. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. As you know, we will be sharing the recording and the slide deck, and I've shared the link to the website, but we'll be sure to include that in the follow-up email that goes out to everybody who joined us today. Also, if you want more of a hands-on support and or want to spend some more time diving into the data with us, you're always welcome and to reach out to myself, Mayana, Maria to help in that process. We will share links to that as well. But want to take a minute or two to see if there are any questions for us right now that we have a few minutes of time. And Maria, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. Not hearing any questions. I think we can now wrap up. Thank you so much again, everybody, for joining. We'll stick around just to see if any folks have any lingering questions for us. But thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Bambi. Thank you so much, everybody, for your kind words. You will see our emails here where you can reach out to us if you have questions navigating the data or want more in-depth data as well. The probation data, we're not sharing it here, but again, we will be able to provide that to you upon request. So thank you so much. We did have a question. Can the tools go full screen? Maria, do you know in people's browsers if they can do full screen when using the map?
Yeah, so you can take the embed, and if you take the iframe and you're putting it on a site, then you can adjust the dimensions of it. But beyond that, there isn't any way to just kind of like right click it or anything and go full screen right now. But we can look into that for the next update.
Thank you. If you need help doing that, again, feel free to reach out. And then Maria and do you mind dropping in your emails in the chat so that way folks have that going out as well? Thank you. Okay, and Layla, one of our colleagues, says you can enlarge the zoom on your browser, which should increase the size of the map as well. Thank you, Layla. Maria, I think you shared your Gmail account. If you don't mind sharing your advanced project. Thank you.
Sorry, reflex.
That's fine. Yeah. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'll play some music as we start to close folks out. And if more questions come in, feel free to drop them in the chat.